Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Eileen Chevalier and I created the typewriter alphabet. Today we are going to look at Corolla shapes. Botanists love to name things, and the shapes of a flower's petals, which is called the corolla, are especially fun. In this lesson, we'll look at different ways to name the shapes of flowers. So we're going to get some materials. Of course, you're going to want your typewriter alphabet flashcards. And another book that's amazing and super helpful for this lesson is the DK Smithsonian Flora book. Specifically, we're going to look at pages 188 and 189. So that's the one you want to find. Sorry. But before we look at those books, we're going to write some definitions. Symmetrical. Two halves of a bisected object having the same parts placed in the same places on both sides. Radial symmetry. Identical wedges meeting at a central point. Any cut through the center results in symmetrical halves. Bilateral symmetry. Only one set of halves is symmetrical. All right, so now let's get into our questioning and investigating. For today's activities, we are going to need some flowers. So try to collect a variety of monocots and eudicots. So just a refresher for eudicots and monocots and how to tell the difference. For eudicots, it's pretty easy, especially when we're looking at the corolla shape, because the sepals on the eudicots are really easy to tell. So if you look at this rose, the sepals are down here, they're green, super different than the petals. So it's really easy to tell the difference between these green sepals, which make up the calyx, and the pink petals, which make up the corolla. So the corolla is going to give us the flower shape. On something like a monocot, this beautiful orchid, and today you are using the O card, it's a lot harder to tell. So you can see that there are a lot of things that look like petals, but if you look at the back of one of these, you don't see those green sepals. And that's because monocots don't actually technically have the petals and sepals. We call them tepals because they're so hard to tell apart. So this top piece right here that looks just like these petals, it's pretty indistinguishable, so we call it a tepal. But this would be called the outer tepal because it's the sepal. So you can see on this back one here, 1, 2, 3. There are 3 outer tepals, and those would be the sepals if it were a eudicot. And then the front ones, which are these 2 ones on the side here, and then this crazy one, you can see it a little bit better on the side, this one right here. So those are technically what would be the petals. So it's a little tricky, and that's why we have that first question. So it's something for us to consider. So generally when we're reading about flower shapes, what they want us to look at is the corolla, and that's the arrangement of all of the petals. But when you're looking at monocots, it gets a little tricky because the tepals are confusing because those, what would be the sepals, those outer tepals, look a lot like petals. So the first question is to find a monocot flower with tepals instead of petals and sepals. What type of symmetry does the flower have? Next, take off the outer tepals, which would be the sepals. Does the type of symmetry change or does it stay the same? Why? Do you need the entire perianth to determine a flower's symmetry? So perianth is a word that we talked about before when we talked about petals, tepals, and sepals. And that just means everything that is around the anthers. So peri means around, anth stands for anthers. So inside this rose are the anthers and the pistil, but the anthers are on the outside of the pistil. So all of these things that are surrounding it. So all of these petals, which is the corolla, and all of the calyx, which are all the sepals, This whole thing is the perianth, which is different from just the corolla. So if we're going to look at this rose and we look at just these petals, this is the corolla. All right, so let's just look at an example. So if you look in your book, or if you don't have a book, you can look at your flashcards. We'll just look at the flashcards because we'll cross-reference. So let's look at the daffodil. The daffodil has one of the most fun corolla shapes. So it looks like a little crown. So if you take, these are the outer tepals, the ones that are out here. So that would be the sepals. So let's take those off and just look at this part that's in the center. It is called a corona corolla. So the corona just means crown. So this part that's in the center, and when it's a daffodil, when you see the flower, it's completely around. So it's just like a little crown that you could wear, right? And because it's round and it's all the same, is that going to be radial symmetry? Like you could cut it in any direction and it would still be the same on both sides? Or do you have to only cut it in one direction? And if you take these outer tepals off, does that change the symmetry of it? And does that change the way we're identifying the corolla shape? I just want you to be aware of, it's so tricky to identify. The hardest thing about corolla shapes is figuring out what the corolla is on any given flower because they're just so tricky. And monocots look different than unicots. So I just wanted to go over a couple of those. And then as far as, I'm going to show you my drawing of the orchid. So if you see a flower on here that has a crazy shape in one direction, like this orchid does, then you're going to know that it's zygomorphic, which means it's bilateral symmetry. You can only cut it one direction because it has that really crazy petal right here that has to get cut in half in order for it to be symmetrical. So that one's definitely zygomorphic, and we already looked at the actual flower, so it wouldn't change if we include the outer tepals on there. Using the pictures in Flora, pages 188 through 189, determine the symmetry and flower shape of your flowers. Is there one shape that's most common? Make sure that you are only looking at the corolla and not the inflorescence. So if you remember sunflowers, and you can see this when we do the sunflower dissection video, I actually cut the teeny tiny ray florets and disc florets, and we talk about their flower shape. So it's not the entire flower. You have to look in deeper and see what's happening with each one of those tiny florets. Sunflowers have a capitulum inflorescence with many, many tiny flowers. You have to break just one tiny flower off to examine. So in order to do that, you're probably going to want an ocular, which is like a teeny tiny magnifying glass. So sometimes they're really easy and large to see, and then sometimes, especially with those capitulum inflorescences, you'll need something that will help you see them up close. All right, let's look at a couple more examples. I'm going to use some of these here just to kind of show you. So speaking of those capitulum inflorescences, here's one that's really tricky. So it looks like it just has, a radial symmetry. All these outer petal looking things seem to be coming from this central point. But then what you have to ask yourself, because what you're looking at are the petals. So you have to think, okay, to find the petals, I have to find the anthers because the petals are going to be right outside the anther. So if you look at this flower, can you see any anthers? I can't, right? Like they're not visible to me. So what I did was actually use my ocular and I looked really close, and every single one of these teeny tiny little yellow, it's not just one piece in the center. This is all many florets in there, and every single one of them has 5 petals. So if you want to really see the flower shape of this one, you have to zoom in and look at each one of those teeny tiny ones, and they're not open yet. So that's another tricky thing. Like as a flower opens, it can actually change shape, which we'll look at next. If you remember, I told you about Lily of the Valley and how it has a campanulate shape. I actually found a flower with a campanulate shape. So this is a bell-shaped flower, but if you look at it before it's opened fully, it looks like an urn-shaped flower. So, and then these look really different. They almost look like a tubular shape. So how much the flower has opened also changes what the shape looks like. So when you are identifying a Corolla shape, you're going to definitely want to make sure that you get one that is fully open, right? For your journal activities, there are two. The first is to make drawings of the flower shapes that you discovered in this lesson. You can include some from the Flora book as well. So if you can't find all these, which I couldn't, but some of these are really great. So they're all of these flower shapes. So if you just want to copy a couple of these into your journal, especially if they're ones that you really want to find. So if you're like, oh, I really want to find a bilobate flower, right? So write it in your journal. And then when you are going out and going to an arboretum or going to a garden, then you can look for those flowers. And when you find them, you can document that in your journal. Another really fun one to do is the calcarate and the tubular. So both of those that are in here, you can actually find examples of in the typewriter alphabet, but I'm not going to tell you which ones they are because I don't want to give it away. I want you to find them for yourself. You're going to make your drawings and then visit a park, nursery, or botanical garden to see if you can find more examples. If you see a new type, just draw it so you can look up the shape name later. So it's very likely, because there's so many kinds of flowers, so it's very likely that you'll find a flower that doesn't have the shape or doesn't seem to have the shape of one of the ones that you've already identified, one of the ones that you've already seen what the shape name is. So you can just write that down and then look it up. Second activity is to go through the flashcards and see if you can identify the flower shapes. Hint, if the half of the flower that I drew is a unique shape, like the orchid that we talked about, the symmetry will be bilateral. Label some coloring sheets with the Corolla shape and include that in your journal. So you can do two things, at least two things. So one thing that you can put in is the symmetry. Is it bilateral symmetry or radial symmetry? And the other thing that you can put in is the name of the flower shape. And something that I find really interesting is that sometimes it seems like there's more than one flower shape, and that's totally fine. Just mark down both of the things that you're seeing. That isn't, always necessarily true, but especially with something special like the calcarate, and I'll show you that right here. That might be that's like a special flower part, and so that's a special shape, but then that's only part of the flower shape. So you can also identify the other part of the flower and what that shape is. So it can get a little complicated. So remember all those things, especially those tricky things about identifying what the Corolla actually is on your flower. Make sure that it's fully opened. Make sure that you're not looking at a capitulum inflorescence. If you are, make sure you take off one of those teeny tiny florets and figure out what the shape is of that. And with the monocots, make sure that you're able to identify what those outer tepals are and the inner tepals are. All right, I think that's it, guys. I would love to see examples of your drawings, so feel free to tag me in them, or share them on any of the social media platforms. I would love to see them and see what you guys find. I'll see you next time. Bye.